good morning, everyone. My name is Arezoo Najibzadeh, and I'm the Manager of Canadian Programs at Oxfam Canada. Today, I am joined by a group of feminist leaders from across what is currently known as Canada to reflect on the federal budget of 2023 through a feminist lens. Although we are gathered here virtually, we would like to acknowledge the lands upon which we reside and work and play. I'm personally joining you from the traditional, unceded, and unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin people, and want to recognize that the historical and ongoing oppression and colonization of all Indigenous peoples, cultures, and lands is a struggle that is deeply connected to the issues we are talking about here today. We commit to acting in solidarity with First Nations, Inuits, and Métis peoples in their struggles for self-determination and decolonization, and so in support of the calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the calls for justice of the National Inquiry on the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. We also encourage you all to learn and act upon them as well. Just a few housekeeping notes. We will not have time for questions today, but there will be an email list and a contact list sent out to all of you after the webinar so that you can get in touch with speakers individually. Also, you can view captions by clicking the Show Captions button on Zoom, and there's also options for English and French interpretation that you can also access by clicking the interpretation button. Now I will pass it on to our first speaker, Liz Martin from Women's Shelters Canada.
Thank you so much for allowing me to share a few words with you this morning. Although I've had limited time to review the budget, it appears as though reference to gender-based violence is limited to the Statement on Gender Equality and Diversity in Canada. The document acknowledges the increase in gender-based violence, but this is not accompanied by any new investments to address it. As we know, Budget 2022 included an allocation of $539 million for the National Action Plan to End Gender-Based Violence. These funds are being transferred to the provinces and territories and will begin to roll out during this fiscal year. On this front, we have two major preoccupations. The first is linked to accountability and oversight. As Canada's National Action Plan begins to come to light, it is imperative that systems be in place to ensure accountability and transparency. As a first step, an independent oversight mechanism must be implemented. All evidence points to the need for a council of independent experts from the sector to support the success of the National Action Plan. Accountability also entails setting up a robust monitoring, evaluation, accountability, and learning framework. Intended outcomes need to be effectively measured, and the results of these measurements, including how and where funds are distributed within the provinces and territories, must be easily accessible to civil society. The second is linked to the federal government's strategy to end gender-based violence. This strategy has been more or less dormant since 2019. In the coming year, we will continue to advocate for funding in Budget 2024 for the federal strategy on gender-based violence, and will continue to monitor the process of implementation of the National Action Plan with provinces and territories. The issue of access to safe and affordable housing is intrinsically linked to gender-based violence. One of the major reasons why shelters and transition houses are constantly having to turn away women and children is that there is no safe and affordable housing. This rings true in all areas of the country, rural and urban, northern and remote. It was extremely disappointing to see that Budget 2023 made no investment in the area of safe and affordable housing. We had hoped that the Women and Children's Shelter and Transitional Housing Initiative, which was in Budget 2021, would be renewed as it was oversubscribed by over 100%. In the coming year, we will continue to advocate for more funding as part of the National Housing Strategy and more transparency in being able to track the objectives and commitments made in the strategy linked to gender equality. Thank you so much.
All right, next up, we have Leila Sarangi from Campaign 2000 and Family Service Toronto.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me to be here. I'm calling in from Toronto, which is covered under the One Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Agreement and the Treaty 13 Toronto Purchase. Campaign 2000's mission is to end child and family poverty, which of course is a women's issue. Child poverty is an indicator of the poverty of mothers. And it is a multidimensional experience, but for the purposes of today's talk, I'm going to focus specifically on income security measures, which were not a lot in this federal budget. It's extremely disappointing considering what's being called an affordability crisis. A lot of middle-income families and women and mothers are feeling the pinch, but it's worse for those who fall into poverty or who have been living in poverty and feeling these struggles and dealing with these struggles for a very long time. During the pandemic in 2020, $102 billion were spent on pandemic transfers from the federal government to individual families. So things like the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, the CERB, they weren't poverty reduction programs, but that's exactly the effect that they had. When we look at the data from 2020, we saw poverty rates in Canada drop in a way that they've never happened historically. So we know that those income transfers work and make a real meaningful difference in the lives of our community members. In budget 2023, there is nothing that comes close to this, no expenditure for transfers to individuals or family that comes close. One of the headlines is the GST rebate, which has been extended. It's a $2.5 billion extension, and it's being marketed as the grocery rebate. It's not very much. It amounts to $467 for an eligible couple with 2 children and $225 for eligible seniors, $234 for eligible individuals. That's barely one grocery bill, and it's only a one-time top-up. So it's not broad enough. Groceries are going to remain high for a very long time, and it doesn't actually address the reason we have inflation, which is a lot is due to corporate profits. We saw measures to expand the tax filing system. Benefits are delivered through the income tax system. So there is a recommitment to automatic tax filing for what they've called vulnerable and low-income Canadians, which can be good, but it's a really slow process. The Canadian Emergency Response Benefit was designed and delivered within a couple of weeks, so that it's taken years for the federal government to just recommit to an automatic tax filing system is way too slow. And I will just, the last thing I will note is that there is a doubling down of CERB repayment. So the federal government has been asking people to repay their emergency response benefit. It disproportionately affects women, Indigenous people, racialized people, youth who are more likely to receive the CERB. And there's an extra $53.8 million to go after these families to repay those benefit amounts with money that they just don't have. So overall, we're pretty worried and disappointed by this budget. And I'll leave it there. Thank you so much.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Samya Hassan, and I'm joining you from the unceded territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit. I am the Executive Director of the Council of Agencies Serving South Asians, which is one of the founding steering committee members of Color of Poverty, Color of Change. Color of Poverty is a network of organizations and individuals that are committed to advocating for marginalized and vulnerable populations in Canada. The federal budget this year has some aspects that we can celebrate, while it doesn't go nearly as far as we would want them to on other items. Having a dedicated anti-racism secretariat at the Privy Council office to take on a whole of government approach and provide racial equity analysis on all government policies is something that we've been advocating for and is welcomed. Commitment to a national action plan to combat hate is also welcomed. However, there is no mention of an online hate legislation or an anti-racism legislation in the budget. Without resources, these much needed legislation cannot be implemented, and there in dire need, or our communities are in dire need of these legislations. Our youth are struggling online and their mental health is being deteriorated because of the online harms that are being caused to them. We are encouraged by the funding for Black and Indigenous communities, as well as for women's programs, including for mental health support, education, and employment. However, more needs to be done to remove barriers for Black and Indigenous and racialized women, such as the gender pay gap and equitable appointments and hiring in senior and higher level positions within government. Funding for temporary foreign worker programs through the employer compliance regime is also encouraging. However, we are calling for, with other partners in this room, for status regularization, which tackles the root cause of the issue of worker abuse. We are also disappointed by the budget's allocation for collecting biometrics for immigrants and refugees to tackle delays, when we have evidence to show that these delays are actually not caused by identity confusion, rather by systemic barriers such as bias and prejudice. Biometrics disproportionately disadvantage Black and racialized communities by treating naturalized citizens differently than those who are here, and perhaps creating greater systemic barriers such as new fees or geographic access. The Canadian Dental Care Plan is also a welcome program, especially for low-income people. However, again, we're concerned about who will fall through the cracks if they don't have private coverage and they're just above the low-income cutoff for this program to be eligible for it. The program should be universal for those who are in need and without private insurance. Finally, while we support the income support programs at this critical time, when the poorest in Canada are struggling to keep afloat, we are seriously concerned that these supports, when tied to the tax system, and they leave out racialized communities with barriers to filing their taxes, or those who exist outside of the tax system, yet are some of the poorest in Canada. So we urge the government to do better to keep people afloat during these very difficult times. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Kelly Bowden, and I am the Director of Policy and Advocacy for Action Canada for Sexual Health and Rights. And I'm calling in today from the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. Action Canada is a progressive pro-choice charity that advocates for changes in policy, legislation, and the introduction of services that help ensure that people across Canada and around the world can have full access to their sexual and reproductive health and rights. From a sexual and reproductive health and rights perspective, this budget has a couple of wins. I think there's some key things that we want to ensure are celebrated in here. There is a $36 million investment in the continuation of the Sexual and Reproductive Health Fund at Health Canada. And the impact of the past number of years of this fund has already been profound, from ensuring that people are able to access abortion care, to developing critical resources to improve access to sexual health information for LGBTQ people, Two-Spirit communities, and disabled communities, including autistic youth. The program supports evidence-based programming and helps target interventions that ensure that the folks who are least able to access sexual health services in this country are able to do that. So this is a great win. And I think at the same time, we, along with a number of organizations, have been advocating for this to become a permanent fixture at Health Canada. And so this is something that we will continue to push for and hope to see in future budgets. Another win around the sexual health perspective is the continuation of the women's program. So this is a pool of financing within Status of Women that can continue to support the capacity work and expanding programming of women's rights and feminist organizations across the country. And I know there's folks who will delve into that a little bit more, but kind of understanding the underpinning that investments in advancing gender equality are also investments in ensuring that people have the supports needed to be able to claim their right to health. A couple of other nuggets in here which are interesting to recognize is a legislative move to introduce pregnancy loss leave for federally mandated employees. So this is something that can be precedent setting and hopefully provide further expansion of that leave over time. There is also a $45 million investment in student loan mitigation, student loan repayments. And it's targeted specifically to enable medical students to repay loans if they're practicing in communities of under 30,000 people. So this is an interesting move where we're looking at the hopeful possibility that this can encourage further healthcare practice in more remote areas. And primary healthcare is a really important piece in being able to ensure that people can access sexual health services. So primary caregivers can provide medication abortion. They can also help refer people to specialized sexual health services. And we know that in terms of abortion access in this country, that rural and remote areas are some of the hardest to reach those services in. I think the two big misses in the budget are obviously pharmacare. We continue to be a country with a national healthcare system with no system to ensure that people can access drugs that they need to support accessing a full range of healthcare services. So from a sexual health perspective, this is a real focus around ensuring access to universal contraception, fertility work, HIV/AIDS medication. There's a whole host of things in there that are just continuing to not be accessible to huge swaths of the population. And then the other piece is also on the international front, to recognize that there was a significant cut to international assistance in this budget. So in a year where there are, a cost of living crisis in this country, but compounding crises around the world, it is very disheartening to see the government taking a step back from the investment that we're going to be making in supporting colleagues around the world, partners around the world, and just understanding that to ensure that people attain their sexual health rights, that we can't roll back investments in water, in accessing nutrition, in accessing infrastructure, and accessing care, that all of these rights are directly interrelated. And so in an international context, hoping that we can see advancements of that in the future. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. My name is Debbie Owusu-Akyeeah. I am the Executive Director of the Canadian Centre for Gender and Sexual Diversity, which is headquartered here in Ottawa on unceded and unsurrendered Algonquin territory. CCGSD is a national organization dedicated to building a future without discrimination for 2S LGBTQI+ youth and people. And our mission is to empower gender and sexually diverse communities through education and advocacy. There's been an unprecedented spike in anti-2S LGBTQ+ hate in Canada and internationally, and Budget 2023's failure to deliver new funding explicitly for 2S LGBTQI communities sends a clear message. Additional support from the government will be limited, and queer and trans Canadians must face the threats that we're dealing with alone. The 2S LGBTQI+ action plan that was announced back in August 2022 is being treated as a finish line and not a starting point. Ourselves, alongside some of our colleagues, celebrate the adoption of what was one of the things we recommended, which was the extension of the Sexual and Reproductive Health Fund. This $36 million commitment provides a glimmer of hope for what we see as a priority around comprehensive sexual and reproductive health and education for all Canadians, but especially our youth. At CCGSD, we're pleased to know that there are opportunities created for 2S LGBTQI youth by the extension of this fund, because this funding commitment is going to allow CCGSD and our allies to continue working towards building a truly comprehensive sexual education across this country that creates better health outcomes for young people. A more queer-friendly, more feminist, and more compassionate sexual health education makes life better for everyone. And CCGSD is going to continue to fight for the rights of 2S LGBTQ young people to access the sexual and reproductive care, services, and education that they deserve. We also really welcome the commitment to the women's program, as it's going to support gender equity, and we see that as also providing supports for queer and trans rights, and we're going to continue to advocate for that as well. I want to emphasize that these two wins that we should absolutely celebrate are a testament to the strong feminist advocacy of many of the people in this room today. It is, however, still very disappointing that this budget does not include commitments to support the immediate safety and well-being of queer and trans Canadians. We don't feel confident that the security infrastructure program that had some funding commitments is structured in a way that's actually going to protect at-risk 2S LGBTQI+ events, including pride festivals or drag story hours. We look forward to the action plan to combat hate, but there's no indication from this budget that it contains any specific funding dedicated to combating anti-2S LGBTQ hate, but specifically anti-trans hate. The lack of meaningful new investments to fix the housing crisis means queer and trans youth who to this day are massively overrepresented in Canada's homelessness population, will continue to struggle to find safe and affordable housing. We're also really concerned that this budget didn't deliver on its promise for a mental health transfer, meaning that the quality of mental health care will remain out of reach for many 2S LGBTQ young people, especially those who are most vulnerable. And I think it's important to also mention that cuts to Canada's international assistance are coming at a time when SOGIESC rights are being under attack across the entire world. And human rights defenders need Canada's leadership right now. And the message from this budget is that our leadership isn't going to show up. And so for us, we want the words of support to 2S LGBTQ communities to match the funding priorities and commitments. 2S LGBTQ organizations and our allies across the country should view this budget as an indicator for the need of further advocacy and cross-sector and cross-movement coordination. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Faye Johnstone. I'm the Executive Director of Wisdom to Action, a consulting firm and social enterprise working on 2S LGBTQIA+ issues, gender justice, and mental health. And I'm joining today from unceded, unsurrendered Algonquin Anishinaabe territory, colonially known as Ottawa. And my firm is based in Chipuktuk, Mi'kma'ki, also known as Halifax, Nova Scotia. As a firm, we leverage our resources and platform to advocate on 2S LGBTQIA+ issues and challenge governments to act on 2S LGBTQIA+ health, rights, and safety. 8 years in, we've seen a lot of really good lingo from this government on 2S LGBTQIA+ issues, and we've also seen some very integral pieces of work. But 2S LGBTQIA+ communities have not seen the level of care and support that we need, that we were promised, and that we expected from this government. There have undoubtedly been some good steps: protection of trans rights, legislative efforts to ban conversion practices, and some historic, albeit insufficient, investments in 2S LGBTQIA+ community organizations. At this point, I believe that we as a community are tired of being used as symbols of where this government stands when their actual concrete support doesn't flow in anywhere near the volume that we need. And over those 8 years, the context of our community has changed significantly. In the past 3 years alone, we've seen a staggering rise in Canada and around the world of anti-2S LGBTQIA+ hate. In community, we're seeing fear and anxiety over the future of our rights, our people, and our very fundamental safety. We are seeing fear of harassment and hate directly impacting our mental health and our safety. And I've personally been targeted by a tsunami of hate that has left me rattled. In the last month alone, I've received thousands of hateful messages and mentions and emails, and worried about my in-person safety when I speak at events or go out in public because of the target painted on my back by far-right groups. Budget 2023 was a missed opportunity for this government to show its support for 2S LGBTQI communities and to show that it goes beyond pride photo ops and empty statements. I care less about what this government says and more about what it does. And when it comes to queer and trans communities, it is not doing much. On the good side, we have seen a commitment in this budget to ensure that anti-2S LGBTQI+ hate will be meaningfully included and addressed in the upcoming action plan to combat hate. But without details and without meaningful engagement of our communities to inform what that action plan looks like, that commitment itself is far from enough. There was some good funding commitment for Pride festivals through Heritage Canada, but even that fell short. And as we often are, we were one of many communities listed, and we were, as we always are, listed at the end. What I would have liked to see would have been a further investment in the 2S LGBTQI+ action plan that was unveiled this past August. It committed $100 million over 5 years to 2S LGBTQ communities and issues. It was billed to us as a whole of government approach, but most of it lives at Women and Gender Equality Canada. And that further demonstrates that this government is not taking queer and trans issues seriously, but imagining they can put us in one department, put out a lot of nice statements, and that our communities will be happy. But we are not in this fight to see a couple nice statements or a few small changes. We are in this fight to address the socioeconomic realities of our communities, to create safety, and to advance the rights of all queer and trans people. It is particularly disappointing at this stage that there was no funding included for a special envoy on international LGBTQIA+ rights, which has been called for multiple years from the Dignity Network, who represent and play a key role in international 2S LGBTQ advocacy and challenging the federal government to better advocate for our communities abroad. Amid legislative attacks on our communities in Uganda in particular, as well as in the US and the UK, it is disappointing that Canada has once again not dedicated the funding that we need to continue our role as a champion of LGBTQ rights at home and abroad. While I am again very happy to see a commitment to LGBTQ communities in the upcoming national strategy or national action plan to address hate, it is disappointing that they are not responding with immediacy. We are seeing hundreds of protests across this country targeting queer and trans community spaces and drag events in particular. We are seeing our organizations subjected to hate, and we are seeing our community leaders targeted with a degree of vitriol online that is truly staggering. We need immediate action now, not simply a mention in a yet to be released anti-hate strategy. We have a window of opportunity in Canada to act now before we follow the path of the US and the UK and see the safety, inclusion, and well-being of 2SLGI+ people in this country further jeopardized. In 10 years of 2SLGI+ activism, I have never been as worried as I am today, and our communities are scared. Hate is rising online and in person, and it is disappointing that this government and this budget does not recognize that in any meaningful way. This government will use all of the right words, but they are not providing our communities with the tangible support that we need. And my heart goes out to queer and trans people across this country who are looking to this government for support, who are looking to this government and this budget for support, and have been left out once again. Thank you so much for having me.
I believe you can see me at this point. Yes, great. Faye, thank you for that and your important words. Everyone, my name is Emilie Coyle. I'm the Executive Director of the Canadian Association of Elizabeth Fry Societies. Our work of our head office takes place on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation, and I am humbled to be here with the rest of the feminist leaders on this call. The Canadian Association of Elizabeth Fry Societies, which is also known as CAFES. I'm speaking slowly. I took note, Melissa, for the interpreters. We've been working with and alongside criminalized women and gender diverse people since 1978. We do this through awareness raising, public engagement, legal reform, legal intervention, and all of that we aim to disrupt the conditions that maintain women and gender diverse people in cycles of violence, poverty, and criminalization. And our ongoing work to address the ways that the women and gender diverse people that we work with are routinely excluded from community and denied their humanity is an important feminist issue. And it's for that reason that we're very grateful to be here with you today. And so when we were looking at the budget 2023, we were paying attention not only to the feminist sector funding specifically, and we too celebrate the wins and the investment in the women's program and sexual reproductive health that have already been mentioned. And we're eager to continue our work with women and gender equality on the work that we've started and continue to do together. But we're also looking at the budget for investment in the sector that works with criminalized people. And more specifically, we were hopeful that there would be mention of funding announced to action the federal framework to reduce recidivism. For those of you who aren't in this work, the Reduction of Recidivism Framework Act received royal assent in June 2021. And so we will be coming up on 2 years since it was enacted. And among other things, this government is required to initiate pilot projects and develop standardized and evidence-based programs aimed at reducing recidivism. And they also are tasked with reviewing and implementing international best practices related to the reduction of recidivism. Now, recidivism is a loaded term, and the definition of which is still a little vague, even within the government documents. However, we know in our work that the numbers of people who are returning to prison after serving a sentence are still too high. And in our opinion, that number that we should all be aiming for is 0%. We don't want anyone returning to prison. And the reasons that people return to prison are complex, but they often involve the same lack of access to the social determinants of health. And in the case of women and gender diverse people specifically, there are gendered complications, which include lack of diverse training and education inside the prisons, as well as gendered and paternalistic conditions of release and community corrections control. What we do know is that the conditions that lead people to becoming criminalized in the first place are mirrored in the conditions that lead people to being included in the numbers of people who return to prison. And those are poverty, misogyny, racism, the ongoing effects of colonialism, homophobia, transphobia, and more. So we know what we need to do. We've been working on this for 2 years. We've been consulted for 2 years. We see the government recognizing the importance of investment in communities so that we can all prevent criminalization and recriminalization of people. Pillars have been identified, which include housing, positive support networks, health, employment, and education. And so we get to budget 2023. And in this budget, if you are looking at investment in work that involves criminalized people, you will see investment in the new Miscarriage of Justice Review Commission, which aims to assist people with wrongful convictions, which is extremely important, and we're all eager to see how this commission will carry out its mandate. There was also vague reference to tackling gender-based violence in the prison and justice system in order to ensure that those systems do not perpetuate systemic inequalities for marginalized groups. And so we will be eager to explore this further. However, in Budget 2023, there was no specific mention of investments in this federal framework to reduce recidivism, which is very disappointing to those of us who have invested already so much of our time and energy in the development of this framework, and we're now ready to carry it out. And so it's going to be very difficult for this government to meet its obligations under the Reduction of Recidivism Act without specific investments. We're going to continue to advocate for ways to action the goals of prevention of criminalization and recriminalization going into the future. Thank you so much.
Good morning. My name is Pam Rick, and I'm the Executive Director and General Counsel of the Women's Legal Education and Action Fund, also known as LEAF. LEAF is a national nonprofit organization that works to advance the equality of women, girls, trans, and non-binary people. We do this through litigation, law reform, and public legal education. Today, I want to speak to Budget 2023's $160 million commitment to the Women's Program to fund organizations that serve women. We are very pleased with this aspect of the budget. Overall, this maintains Women's Program funding levels at $100 million per year, which is a crucial investment in feminist organizations that deliver frontline services, policy analysis, research, and advocacy, among so many other things, to benefit women, girls, trans, and non-binary people in this country. This budget commitment follows the advocacy of dozens of women's and gender equity organizations and our allies to renew and expand existing capacity building funding that is delivered through the Women's Program. This funding came from a Budget 2018 commitment to provide capacity building funding of $20 million per year for 5 years. This funding was crucial to the sector after feminist initiatives experienced a decade of underfunding and helped many of our organizations weather the instability of the COVID-19 pandemic. This month, over 250 feminist organizations were set to lose capacity building funding from the federal government that we had received through the Budget 2018 commitment. This would have been devastating for our sector, resulting in cuts to crucial programming and staff. This is why LEAF and dozens of feminist organizations across Canada, together with thousands of individuals, participated in a public advocacy campaign to renew and expand capacity building funding. Through this campaign, we were asking for a commitment of $125 million over 5 years in Budget 2023 to dedicate to capacity building funding. While Budget 2023 falls short of this ask, we are very glad that our advocacy resulted in ensuring that the Women's Program funding was maintained for the next 3 years at $100 million each year. We are also glad that the federal government has heard the message that some of this funding must be allocated by wage to capacity building funding in order to strengthen our sector and, more importantly, benefit women, girls, trans, and non-binary people in Canada. And we look forward to working with WAGE over the coming years to ensure that that funding goes towards capacity building funding in part. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Arezoo. I am the Director of Policy and Communications at the National Right to Housing Network. And as someone who works to advance the human right to adequate housing, which was historically legislated by this very government almost 4 years ago, I am disappointed with this year's federal budget because at a time of economic instability and recession like this, a feminist and human rights-based government would prioritize its duty to its most vulnerable, including the over 1.7 million people facing deep housing precarity and homelessness every day. Human rights are not hats that you put on and take off when they're convenient. They're a way of approaching governance. But instead, our once progressive government is slapping Band-Aid solutions on growing housing precarity while prioritizing private sector investments. And while there were some positive measures on other fronts in this budget, it mentions homelessness only 3 times in 255 pages and fails to address the structural housing barriers facing tenants who are disproportionately single mothers, women and gender diverse people, Indigenous peoples, immigrants, refugees, youth, international students, and other under-resourced communities who are the fuel of our economy. It's clear that the government's plan for addressing our broken housing system is to maintain the status quo, which means continuing to incentivize for-profit investors and developers who are driving up the cost of housing, while leaving marginalized populations who can't reach the Canadian dream of home ownership out in the cold, and sometimes quite literally because homelessness is on the rise across the country. And this neglect is not only an overt violation of Canada's legislated right to housing, but also especially frustrating because we in the nonprofit sector know how to do more with less. We've always had to. And so we've already given our government solutions that would cost nothing but political will. For example, rein in and stop giving tax incentives to for-profit investors and large corporate landlords who, by the way, will always find other ways to make money. Stop creating new tax incentives for people to save and then spend even more money on rising homeownership costs. And stop normalizing that people are spending this much money on housing in the first place. Instead, reallocate these tax revenues to create and maintain deeply affordable and non-market housing. Regulate our housing market to prevent the hemorrhage of Canada's dwindling affordable housing stock. Track and publish the impacts of your housing investments on marginalized populations so that we can make sure our policies are actually effective. And revise Canada's national housing strategy to impose stronger affordability criteria and tenant protections across all policies and programs, because public funds should be going towards public good and not profit. So the solutions are simple and all they will take is political will, but sadly that is not what we see in this federal budget, and I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Amanda Arella, and I am joining you today from Toronto, colonially known as Toronto in Treaty 13 territory. I'm the Director of Public Policy Advocacy and Strategic Communications at YWCA Canada. We are the country's oldest and largest gender equity organization, representing YWCAs who are working in 300 communities across 9 provinces and 2 territories. I echo what has already been said in this call. We're happy to see some important wins in this budget, most notably the $160 million in investments to organizations that serve women and equity deserving groups. A strong feminist sector is essential to achieving gender justice in Canada, but we also know that our sector cannot do it on our own. We need the federal government to be a partner in creating systemic change by creating long-term investments in this change. While there are some important wins in this budget also signals that the federal government is stepping away from the bold feminist investments we have seen in previous budgets. I echo much of what Sahar said, and as one of the major housing providers affordable housing for women and gender diverse people, as well as shelter and transitional housing support. YWCA Canada can really only express our disbelief and our disappointment that there is not a single dollar in budget 2023 that was dedicated towards building more affordable housing. We're in the midst of a housing crisis in this country that is deeply gendered. Women and gender diverse people and their families are experiencing the most intense core housing need across the country. Budget 2023's only announcement around affordable housing was that the government intends to support the reallocation of funding from the National Housing Co-Investment Fund repair stream to the new construction stream, essentially moving funds that were dedicated to repairs and renovations to new construction. This is an important and welcome modification because we know that the new construction stream under the co-investment fund is out of money. However, it is also a missed opportunity to provide the federal leadership and financial commitment that we need to end the housing crisis and realize the right to housing for women and gender diverse people. This requires deep investments in building supportive housing and funding not only the construction of 4 walls and a roof, but also the wraparound services and supports that women and gender diverse people need to address the complex barriers they face to accessing safe, supportable, and stable housing. We also see nothing in this budget for shelters and second stage or transitional housing. In a context where domestic violence shelters are stretched beyond capacity and are turning away nearly 1,000 women and their children every night, there is an urgent need for this government to support shelters and transitional housing, to expand and repair the existing system, and for new construction. Feminist organizations, including YWCAs across the country, are ready to build and to expand their services, but they need more funding to do so. We're continuing to advocate for the renewal of the Women and Children's Shelter and Transitional Housing Initiative, and we also continue to advocate for deeper investments in permanent affordable housing across the country. Thank you.
Good morning, and thank you so much to Oxfam, to the Canadian Women's Foundation for organizing this terrific panel. My name is Katherine Scott, and I'm a senior researcher at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives in our national office, which is located on unceded Algonquin and Anishinaabe territory, as colonially known as Ottawa. Very pleased to be here. In my couple of minutes, I wanted to sort of step back and take a look at the larger conversation about where we find ourselves. We've heard certainly a lot of rhetoric over the past year about building back a better future through investments in childcare, healthcare, net zero economy, but as always, and as all of the speakers today have alluded to, certainly actions speak louder than words. And on that score, I certainly wholeheartedly agree with many of the panelists that the federal government seems to be stepping back. It's offering up a multitude of half measures, a grant here, a strategy there, or indeed actually handing off responsibility altogether to deliver on their policy goals, as we saw with the Green Economy Plan this past Tuesday. I think the tension's always been really evident between the neoliberal economic roots of the government and their social justice ambitions. And, that tension's on full display in this budget. There was a moment back in the pandemic when a different progressive vision beckoned, and certainly a different feminist vision beckoned. But, with this budget, I think we've seen the turn. Last year, we saw a pivot. With this budget, it completes the turn. Certainly the voices on Bay Street have been calling on the government to aggressively scale back on their social spending. This is the same group that's currently peddling the discredited narrative that government programs are actually fueling inflation, hurting working families. So, the finance minister herself, and then before the budget came down, stressed that they were not going to be delivering a budget that poured fuel on the inflation fire. And I must say that she certainly delivered on that score, because certainly the affordability measures in this budget are certainly not inflationary. They're very modest. Leila mentioned some of the items, such as the new GST top up, the plans, for instance, there's an increase to Canada student grants. There's obviously the important work they're doing on auto tax filers at CRA. These are really important measures, but as a whole, it's a very, very modest package given the scale of the challenge in front of us. Very disappointing, and certainly very disappointing indeed. You know, and we certainly, Sahar and Amanda were talking about, you know, where we talk about the big misses, certainly affordable housing. If we're going to be talking about what are the factors really impacting Canadians and poor and modest households today, the lack of affordable housing is at the top of the list. We're talking about the impact of inflation. Certainly, there was no real appreciable effort to make any investment or to improve the situation here. Non-market housing providers cannot get shovels in the ground because of desperately the challenges related to rising costs. They can't get the financing at a higher interest rate. It's a really dire situation. Federal government had an opportunity to respond and chose not to. They also didn't take action, and we've been waiting for this for a long time, on EI reform, and it really is remarkable. We're looking down the road. It's a difficult economic road ahead that the budget certainly acknowledges. A lot of folks are saying we're looking at potential recession by the end of the year. Well, how deep it is matters not. Millions of families will certainly be impacted. Millions are already struggling. This government didn't take take fundamental action to reform the EI program, which is one of the primary tools. EI actually failed miserably, of course, when the pandemic hit. We knew we had to bring in emergency programs. So where are the reforms we need to make sure we're recession ready? They also, and no one's mentioned this, like there was nothing on a workforce strategy for care workers. We could talk a long time about what's going on. Certainly the monies were announced in healthcare accords last month, a portion of which will go to personal support workers, like 1.7 billion over that 10-year period. But, all of the major actors were calling for a workforce strategy for the care sector for care workers, and that was clearly absent, not mentioned at all. There were a couple of new tax measures for the wealthy, which are expected to raise in 5 years' time about $4 billion per year. But we're leaving huge sums of money on the table, monies on, that we could effectively bring in taxation on the uber wealthy in Canada that would actually be funding a much more robust response to all of these challenges. I think you're in trouble when the proposals to tax the uber rich are south of the border are much bolder than your own. And you're in trouble when the labor conditions attached to industrial subsidies, such as in the new Green Economy Plan, in fact, are much stronger in the United States, in fact, include childcare in the United States, nary a peep here. And I think you're in trouble when you've got a government that seems to be ceding more control over public policy to big business and the banks. The nature, my colleague Hadrian Merton Cook were responding on the Green Economy Plan. A lot of it was just turning the wheel over to the private sector to take to make the investments needed, take up these subsidies and drive forward their vision of green economy. So it's really challenging issues. I worry what this all means, certainly, for us all. I worry what it means for, delivering on a truly universal childcare system. I worry about what it means about making sure that Indigenous women and girls and LGBTQ folks safe. I worry what it means for lifting people with disabilities out of poverty, because, the words or the funding attached to the new consultation on the new Canada Disability Benefit, that was in the budget, but, no money attached to the actual program itself. These are concerns that will be delivered when the benefit emerges. It'll be of any size or weight at all. So I don't think, the question around whether this is a feminist budget, it's clear that it's not, but certainly it's a wake-up call that we've got to push harder and reach deeper, push harder. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Deanna Sarosi. I'm the Director of Policy and Campaigns at Oxfam Canada, and I'm joining you today from the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. So Oxfam Canada is part of a confederation that works in 87 countries around the world. And we support gender equality advocates here in Canada and around the world to campaign for the changes needed to ensure their rights are upheld. So as you heard from my colleagues in this webinar, the budget has fallen short on many, many fronts. But what I really want to stress here today is that it didn't have to be that way. The government could have capitalized on some key tax justice initiatives. We've seen the richest individuals and corporations make a killing during the pandemic. Inequality was extreme before COVID-19 hit the world, but it has only continued to skyrocket throughout the last 3 years. Just to give you a picture, globally, the richest 1% grabbed nearly 2/3 of all new wealth created since 2020. And Canadian billionaires have seen their wealth grow by a staggering 51% since the pandemic began. And it's particularly food and energy corporations that have more than doubled their profits in 2022. And yet we see no measures in this budget to tax windfall profits for these sectors, despite the Finance Committee budget recommendations. Instead, we see tax credits and subsidies for the energy sector and inadequate handouts such as the grocery rebate to people who are stressed in and day out, how they're going to keep a roof over their heads and their families fed. The budget also walked away from measures to close some of the most expensive tax loopholes, such as the $22 billion a year capital gains exemption and wealth taxes for the richest. Tax justice is a feminist issue as it directly determines how much money the government has available to spend on critical public services and social protection. The government left billions of dollars on the table that could have resourced the feminist priorities highlighted in this webinar to advance gender equality and build a more equal future. What's worse, the government turned its on millions of women and gender diverse people globally who have suffered the biggest brunt of COVID-19, the impacts of climate change and an unjust economic system, all while being under attack for claiming their rights. It is unconscionable to cut foreign aid by 15% at a time when women's rights are under attack, poverty is on the rise, and millions of people around the world are facing climate chaos, hunger, and displacement. We are living in challenging times when one crisis after another is devastating communities and women, girls, trans, and non-binary people, especially from racialized communities, are under attack by anti-rights and white supremacist movements. So at this time, when so many hard-won gains are under threat, bold action is required and tax justice needs to be part of a bold agenda. We haven't seen it in this budget, but as Katherine mentioned, this budget has really just proven that we need to work harder and we need more people to come on board to support gender equality advocates here in Canada to push for the kind of resources that are required to weather this ongoing storm that we're in. So with that, we're closing the webinar today. Thank you so much for joining. As you see, we often think that the budget is, not really relevant to the issues that we're tackling, but it's really at the source of it. And that's why we spent this time to make recommendations to the government on the budget, to advocate for resources for these priorities, and to hold the government accountable to their words and really follow it up with action. So with this, we're closing, and just to let you know, the webinar was recorded. It will be available in English and French on the YouTube channel of the Canadian Women's Foundation. Also, we will be sending the contacts of all speakers to participants today so that they can also follow up outside this webinar with everyone in case there are further issues or comments that you would like to hear. Thank you so much and have a great day.